The Forgotten Professor, Chapter 1. There's a ritual happening right now in a school library in Cordoba, Argentina. A 16-year-old student is walking between dusty bookshelves, carrying a handwritten letter. They don't know why they're doing this. They just feel compelled to. Every year, someone feels this compulsion. Every year, someone leaves a letter in the same spot, section 823, between Poe and Lovecraft. The forgotten PRFESS Sue are what they don't know is that they're feeding something that should have died 20 years ago. Something that was once a man, named Eduardo Vasquez, a literature teacher who loved books more than people, and who discovered, in the cruelest way possible, that love isn't always enough. My name is Carlos Mendoza. I'm an investigative journalist, and I don't believe in ghosts. Or at least, I didn't, until I received an anonymous letter that would lead me into the darkest corners of a story that everyone, the school, the authorities, even the victims' families desperately wanted to keep buried. The letter said simply, if you really investigate the truth, go to San Martin School. Ask about the dead hours. Ask about Professor Vasquez. But don't go alone, and never go after 5 p.m. What I discovered wasn't just a ghost story. It was something far more terrifying. The systematic destruction of a human soul, and how that destruction echoed through decades, claiming young lives with mathematical precision. 3 students dead, all 16 years old, all found with the same phrase scrawled in their notebooks. He chose me. This is the story of how some ghosts aren't born from violent deaths, but from violent forgetting. And this ghost has a mission, to make sure he's never forgotten again. No matter the cost. The drive to Cordoba took me 3 hours. 3 hours to convince myself this was just another dead-end story. Another grieving family looking for supernatural explanations for very human tragedies. I've investigated dozens of these cases. They always follow the same pattern. Unexplained death, desperate relatives, local legends filling the gaps that logic can't. Chapter 2. The first evidence. The drive to Cordoba took me 3 hours. 3 hours to convince myself this was just another dead-end story. Another grieving family looking for supernatural explanations for very human tragedies. I've investigated dozens of these cases. They always follow the same pattern. Unexplained death, desperate relatives, local legends filling the gaps that logic can't. But the moment I stepped out of my car in front of San Martin School, something felt wrong. It was 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. The sun was bright. Kids were playing in the courtyard. Everything looked perfectly normal. So why did I feel like I was being watched? The first person I spoke to was Maria Santos, the head janitor. She'd been working at the school for 32 years. When I mentioned Professor Vasquez, her face went white. Not pale. White. Like someone had drained the blood from her veins in real time. "Why are you asking about him?" she whispered, looking over her shoulder even though we were alone in the hallway. "It's been 20 years. Why can't people just let him rest?" But here's what struck me as odd. She didn't ask who Eduardo Vasquez was. She knew exactly who I was talking about. A man who, according to official school records, never existed. I spent 4 hours in that administrative office, going through every employment record from 2000 to 2005. Every teacher, every substitute, every temporary hire. Eduardo Vasquez's name appeared. Nowhere. Not in payroll. Not in class assignments. Not even in the building access logs. But then I found something that made my blood freeze. A maintenance request from June 16, 2003. One day after Eduardo supposedly died. The request was simple. Emergency cleaning required in library. Biohazard situation. Discretion essential. The request was signed by someone I hadn't heard of yet. Director Elena Torres. The same woman who, according to my research, had been mysteriously promoted to head of school just days after Eduardo's death. I tried calling Director Torres 17 times that day. Every call went to voicemail. But the 18th call, someone picked up. "Stop looking into this," a woman's voice said. Not angry, terrified. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. Some stones are better left unturned." That's when I knew I was onto something real. In 20 years of investigative journalism, I've learned one fundamental truth. The harder people try to bury a story, the more important it becomes. But what I discovered next would make me question everything I thought I knew about death, memory, and the price of being forgotten. Chapter 3. The first student, her name was Carmen Ortega, and when I knocked on her door at 7 p.m. that Tuesday, she looked like she'd been expecting me for years. Not expecting me specifically, but expecting someone who would finally ask the right questions about her son Luis. He was such a bright boy, she told me, her voice barely above a whisper. Always reading, always asking questions about everything. Literature was his passion. Just like she stopped herself mid-sentence, but I knew what she was about to say. Just like Professor Vasquez, Carmen showed me pictures of Luis, a thin boy with curious eyes and a stack of books, always under his arm. But then she showed me the photos from his final months, and the difference was shocking. The light in his eyes had simply vanished. It started in March 2019, Carmen continued. Luis began staying after school, spending hours in the library. At first I was happy. I thought he was just studying more seriously. But then he started talking about someone who understood him. Luis had told his mother about a teacher who appeared in the library during what he called the quiet hours, that twilight period between 5 and 7 p.m., when the school was nearly empty. This teacher, Luis said, knew more about literature than anyone he'd ever met. Carmen brought out Luis's notebook from those final weeks. The handwriting started normal, but progressively became more erratic, more desperate. I read entries like, "He chose me because I understand what it's like to be invisible, and the books speak to him. And now they speak to me too." But the entry that made my hands tremble was dated April 15, 2019. Professor V says that being forgotten is the worst death of all. He says, if I help him be remembered, he'll make sure I'm never alone again. "The last time I saw my son alive," Carmen whispered, "he told me he had a mission. He said he was going to help someone who had been erased from history get there." Story back. He was so excited, like he'd found his purpose in life. Luis Ortega was found 3 days later, at the bottom of Rio Cordoba Bridge. The official report said suicide due to academic pressure. But Carmen showed me something the police report didn't mention. A letter found in Luis's backpack, written in handwriting that wasn't his. The letter read, "Thank you, Luis, for carrying my burden. Now others will know that I existed. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten." It was signed simply, E.V. But here's what haunted me most about Luis's case. Carmen told me that for weeks after her son's death, she kept receiving text messages from his phone. Messages like, "Don't forget me, Mom, and I'm helping the teacher now." The phone company confirmed these messages were sent from Luis's device, which had been destroyed in the fall from the bridge. As I was leaving Carmen's house that night, my own phone buzzed. Unknown number. The message was simple. Ask about Raul Medina, but be careful what you wish to know. I realized then that this wasn't just a story about a dead teacher and a tragic student. This was about something that was actively hunting, actively recruiting, and somehow, it knew I was getting close to the truth. The question that kept me awake that night wasn't who Professor Vasquez had been in life. It was what he had become in death, and how many more students he planned to collect. Chapter 4. The living ghost Raul Medina didn't die. That might sound like good news, but after meeting him, I realized that sometimes death would be a mercy. He's 22 years old now, has been in the psychiatric ward of Cordoba General Hospital for 3 years, and when he looks at you, it's like staring into a well that has no bottom. The nurse who brought me to him whispered a warning. He doesn't talk much anymore. But when he does, it's always about the same thing. The teacher who won't let him sleep. Raul sits by the window all day, staring at nothing. His hands are covered in scars, self-inflicted scratches that spell out letters, over and over again. When I got close enough to read them, my blood went cold. They spelled, "Don't forget." His psychiatrist, Dr. Elena Morales, agreed to speak with me on condition of anonymity. What she told me painted a picture far more disturbing than Luz's. Suicide Raul, she explained, wasn't just haunted by Professor Vasquez. He had become a vessel for him to reach people. I want my story to be told accurately, completely, and in a way that honors both my struggle and the struggle of the students who chose to help me. The patient exhibits symptoms we've never documented before, Dr. Morales explained. He speaks in voices that aren't his own. He knows things about literature, about books he's never read. Sometimes he recites entire lectures, in a teaching style from 20 years ago. Dr. Morales played me a recording from one of Raul's sessions. What I heard made me understand why the staff was terrified. It wasn't Raul's voice speaking. It was deeper, older, filled with a desperate kind of authority. They erased me from every document, every memory, every trace of my existence. But I found a way to remain. Through these young minds, I can continue teaching. Through their pain, I can make them remember what they tried to forget. The psychiatrist told me that Raul's possession, and yes, she used that word, began exactly like Luz's case. March 2021, 2 years after Luz's death. Raul started staying after school, drawn to the library during those twilight hours between day and night. But Raul's case was different. Where Luis had been recruited as a messenger, Raul became something else entirely, a living archive. The entity that was once Eduardo Vasquez had poured its memories, its knowledge, its entire existence, into this young man's mind. He knows things, Dr. Morales continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Personal details about school staff from decades ago. He can describe the layout of classrooms that were remodeled years before he was born, and sometimes, he talks about students who are still alive, calling them by names they had forgotten they ever used. That's when Raul himself entered our conversation. He moved like a sleepwalker, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. When he spoke, his voice carried an unnatural cadence, as if someone else was operating his vocal cords. "You're the journalist, the one asking questions. He's told me about you." I asked who he was, though I already suspected. "The professor. He's pleased with your work. You're helping his story reach more people. But he wants you to understand something important. This isn't about revenge. It's about remembrance. Every soul deserves to be remembered." Luis carried the message. I carry the memories. But there will be others. The professor is very patient and very selective. He chooses those who understand what it means to be invisible, to be forgotten. Then, just as suddenly, it was Raul's voice again, younger, confused, terrified. "Where am I? Why can't I remember yesterday? Please, I just want to go home." As the nurses sedated Raul, Dr. Morales grabbed my arm. "This is why you need to be careful," she hissed. "Whatever this Professor Vasquez was in life, in death he's become something that feeds on young minds, and you're making yourself visible to him." Walking out of that hospital, I realized the horrifying truth. Eduardo Vasquez wasn't just haunting the school. He was building something, a network of young souls, each serving a different purpose, in his plan to never be forgotten again. Another text message was waiting for me. "You understand now, but understanding is just the beginning. Come to the library tomorrow at 5:17 p.m. Come alone. It's time you met me properly." Evie, the question that haunted me as I drove home wasn't whether I would go. It was whether I'd still be myself. When I came back, Chapter 5, the meeting 5:17 p.m. I chose to arrive exactly on time. Not a minute early, not a minute late. 20 years of journalism had taught me that when dealing with the unknown, precision matters. What I hadn't expected was to find the school completely unlocked, as if it had been waiting for me. The corridors felt different in the dying light. During my previous visits, they had been filled with the chaos of student life, voices, laughter, the slam of locker doors. Now, they stretched ahead like arteries of a sleeping beast, and every shadow seemed to watch me pass. The library was darker than I'd expected. Most of the overhead lights were off, leaving only the emergency lighting to cast long, distorted shadows between the bookshelves. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it immediately, a presence that made the air itself feel heavier. Then I heard it. The sound of books being carefully placed on shelves, the methodical work of someone organizing a collection. But there was something wrong with the rhythm. It was too slow, too deliberate, as if whoever was doing it had all the time in the world. "Thank you for coming, Carlos." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Not whispered, not shouted, but spoken at a perfect conversational volume that somehow filled the entire space. It was educated, tired, and carried the weight of someone who had been waiting far too long to have this conversation. I found myself moving toward the literature section 823, without consciously deciding to do so. There, between Poe and Lovecraft, exactly where the students had been leaving their letters, sat a figure that was almost a man. Eduardo Vasquez looked exactly as he had in the few photos I'd found from his teaching days, but translucent, like someone had turned down his opacity to about 60%. He was reading a worn copy of Borges, his finger tracing the lines as if he were preparing a lesson. "You've been very thorough in your investigation," he said, looking up at me with eyes that held no malice, only an infinite sadness. "Luis told me about you before he helped me. Raul confirmed that you were the right person to tell my story properly. I asked him why he was doing this, why the students had to die." Eduardo's expression shifted, and for a moment, the sadness was replaced by something harder, not anger, but a deep, aching frustration. "Die," he repeated. "Carlos, they didn't die because of me. They died because they couldn't carry the weight of being truly seen. Do you understand what it means to be completely erased? To have your existence denied so thoroughly that even your own colleagues pretend you never taught their children." "I don't choose students randomly," Eduardo continued, his voice growing stronger. "I choose those who already understand invisibility." Luis was ignored by his classmates, dismissed by teachers who saw him as just another quiet kid. Raul spent years being the student that no one remembered was even in their class. I offer them something precious, the certainty that they will never be forgotten, that their pain, their existence, will be recorded and remembered. Luis chose to carry my message to the world. Raul chose to become a living archive of my experiences. Both made their choices freely. I challenged him on this. How could children make free choices when being manipulated by a supernatural entity? Manipulated. "Carlos, I was a literature teacher for 6 months before they drove me to suicide. Do you think in that time I developed supernatural powers of persuasion? I simply offer these young people what no adult in their lives ever has: complete, undivided attention, the chance to matter to someone." The ghost, though he felt far too solid to be called that, walked toward me. With each step, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the air. "You want to understand why I can't rest, why I can't simply move on, as people always suggest ghosts should do." Eduardo stopped directly in front of me. "It's because moving on requires that someone, somewhere, acknowledges that you existed in the first place." Eduardo gestured, and suddenly, the air around us was filled with floating documents, school records, employment files, class photographs. But in every single one, there were gaps where he should have been. photos with unexplained empty spaces, class lists with missing names, payroll records with deleted entries. They didn't just fire me, Carlos. They erased me, systematically, completely, as if I had never drawn breath. And then, they acted surprised when that erasure didn't take. I asked him what he wanted from me. Why had he guided me to this story? I want what every teacher wants, Eduardo said simply. I want my lessons to reach people. I want my story to be told accurately, completely, and in a way that honors both my struggle and the struggle of the students who chose to help me. But mostly, Carlos, I want to stop. Do you understand? I've been fighting to be remembered for 20 years. I'm tired. I want to rest, but I can't rest while I remain erased from history. Tell my story, all of it. The man I was, the teacher I tried to be, the system that failed me, and yes, the students who paid the price for my inability to simply disappear quietly. Do that for me, Carlos, and I promise you something. I'll stop choosing students. I'll stop reaching out to young minds who feel invisible. I'll finally be able to let go. But if you don't, if this story gets buried like all the others, then I'll have no choice but to continue building my archive of forgotten souls. Because someone, somewhere, needs to remember that we existed. When I looked up from my notes, Eduardo was gone. The library looked normal again. Chapter 6. The Exorcism of Ink and Paper. Asterisk Eduardo Vasquez's promise echoed in my mind for days. Tell my story, and I promise you something. I'll stop choosing students. My journalistic instincts took over. I wrote the most explosive piece of my career. I detailed Eduardo's history, Luis Ortega's death, Raul Medina's torment, and the systematic erasure of records by the school administration, led by Helena Torres. I had names, dates, Luz's notebook, the psychiatrists, recordings. It was a bombshell, and, like most bombshells, it was diffused before it could detonate. My editor, a man I respected, read the entire thing, his face growing paler with each page. Carlos, this is unbelievable, he said, and not in a good way. To publish this without concrete proof, and a talking ghost doesn't count as a source would get us destroyed. San Martin has alumni in very high places. Helena Torres will deny everything. They'll sue us into oblivion. He was right. The same system that erased a teacher could just as easily erase a news story. Eduardo's truth, filtered through bureaucracy and legal fear, would be reduced to a footnote, a conspiracy theory. And his promise would be broken. I could almost feel his desperation stirring again, reaching out for the next invisible teenager to recruit. That's when I understood. I was using the wrong tool. A news story is a shout in the wind. It lasts for a day, then it's gone. Eduardo wasn't news. He was a story. A gothic horror tale that deserved to be bound, preserved on a shelf. He didn't need a journalist. He needed a chronicler. I spent the next 6 months doing something I had never done before. I wrote a book. It wasn't journalism. It was a testimony. Every word was a stone I laid on the grave of a man who never had one. I wove together my investigation, Carmen's words, the echoes in Raul's voice, and most importantly, the conversation in that dark library. I didn't write about Eduardo Vasquez. I wrote the story he asked me to tell. I gave it a simple, direct title, The Forgotten Professor. On the 21st anniversary of his death, on a cold, gray June afternoon, I returned to San Martin School. The library door was unlocked, just as I knew it would be. The air inside was no longer heavy or cold. It was just quiet, a peaceful silence, the kind a reader craves. I walked to section 823, between Poe and Lovecraft. There was no handwritten letter. The space was empty, waiting. With trembling hands, I took the first printed copy of my book and placed it in that exact spot. The moment the book touched the shelf, something shifted. It was subtle, like the release of a tension I hadn't even realized was there. A gentle breeze seemed to pass by me, carrying the faint scent of old chalk and paper. For a brief second, in the reflection of the window pane, I didn't see myself, but the fleeting image of a man in glasses, offering a sad, grateful smile before he dissipated like smoke. The book Eduardo had been holding, the copy of Poilus, no longer on the table. It was gone. I left the library and never looked back. A few weeks later, I called Dr. Morales for one last follow-up. Her voice was lighter. "It's remarkable, Carlos," she said. "Raul, he is coming back. He asked about his family for the first time in years. He still can't remember everything, but the other one is gone. It's like the fever finally broke. Carmen Ortega sent me a letter. She had read the book. 'Thank you,' it said. 'Now I understand the purpose my Luis found. You have given him, and that poor professor, their peace.' I never received another text from an unknown number. The school never again reported an incident during the dead hours. The students' ritual was broken, not because it was forbidden, but because the compulsion simply vanished, its energy spent. Some ghosts aren't exorcised with rites or prayers. They are exorcised by witness. Eduardo Vasquez didn't want to haunt the world. He just wanted the world to acknowledge he was here. And by placing his story on a shelf for anyone to find, I didn't just keep my promise. I gave him what the system denied him, a final, indelible chapter. Do you believe in ghosts? Investigative journalist Carlos Mendoza didn't. To him, they were just stories meant to fill the gaps left by tragedy. But when an anonymous letter leads him to the San Martin School in Cordoba, he discovers a horror far deeper than any supernatural tale. The story of Eduardo Vasquez, a literature professor, erased from history with brutal efficiency. This is no ordinary vengeful spirit. Vasquez is a ghost born of forgetting, an entity that feeds on the invisibility of lonely students, offering them purpose in exchange for helping him be remembered. With a trail of mysterious deaths, and one young man turned into a living archive of his memories, Vasquez is building a legacy of pain to fight his own erasure. In a chilling confrontation in the school library, Carlos is given an ultimatum by the ghost himself: tell his story, completely and truthfully, so he can finally rest, or the hunt for young, forgotten souls will continue forever. The Forgotten Professor is the chronicle of that choice. It is a journey into the darkest corners of memory and neglect, revealing that the most violent cruelty isn't what takes a life, but what denies that a life ever existed. Carlos Mendoza's story proves that sometimes the only way to exorcise a ghost is not to fight it, but to give it what it wants most: a voice, a page, and a chance to be remembered. The final question isn't whether you believe in ghosts, but whether you have the courage to listen to their stories. If this story sent chills down your spine, remember, there are many others still waiting to be told. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. That way you'll make sure the next forgotten voice will be heard.